Welcome back to the course. So what we're going to do this morning is I'm going to get us going on the next section of the course, which has to do with the general question of scaling and scales. And I want to start out, in a certain sense, this particular vignette is about the semantics of the word scale and the way that I will use it with several different meanings in the context of this course. So, of course, semantic precision is great, and it's something that I think that we should always strive for. But it's also true that there are certain words in the English language that have more than one meaning, in much the same way that in mathematics, the letter beta can be used for more than one thing. And that's just the way it is. And so, in this particular instance, what I want to point out is that I will be using the word scale in several different ways. So, one of the ways is, and they're certainly related, is a topic that we've already talked about in some depth, actually, which is what sets the scale of x. So I already asserted earlier in the term that I thought that if I couldn't answer the question of what sets the scale of a given thing, then that probably meant I didn't understand that thing. And so, we used an example. One of the examples we thought of was what sets the number of sugar transporters for a bacterium. And we addressed that question by asking how many carbons are needed to create a new cell, which is primarily driven by proteins. So in other words, we made an approximation, which that the cell matter is largely dictated by protein, and then that led us to a simple estimate of that quantity. Another example that we carried out is what this was when we were thinking about the surface to volume ratio. What sets the radius at which surface decoration with ATP synthase will not be sufficient in order to feed the needs of the bulk of the cell. So what do I mean by that? This sounds a little obscure, but what I mean is that you remember that we made this assertion that the cost to run the cellular economy is something on the order of 10 to the sixth ATPs per micron cubed of cytoplasmic material per second. And so we know if the ATP synthases live on the surface, that they are producing ATP at some rate. And, we addressed the question, which I remind you here, we addressed the question of how dense must the ATP synthases be in order to feed the needs of all the material on the inside. And this led us to this very deep theme of surface to volume ratio, something that's going to come up again and again throughout the course. One of the most exciting cases will be when we talk about compartmentalization of enzymes, where we'll see this wonderful competition between surface and volume effects, just like we're talking about here. So once the radius gets large enough, then the ATP synthases will entirely decorate the surface, and even then, they will not be able to keep up with the demands of the bulk. And so that was our answer to that question. And then, for kicks, I had mentioned what sets the height of mountains. And this one, might seem like it's not an appropriate question in this course, but I actually think it is, because it's a similar question to what dictates the height of the tallest tree on the world, which is, I think, called Hyperion in California. It's a redwood. Or what sets the scale of the radius of the bones of the leg based on the size of the animal, and so on. And so just to reiterate, I think I mentioned this earlier, but I want to just say it again, and I'll actually even do the calculation. So the thought about what sets the height of a mountain is that we're looking for a column of rock that is so large or so high that its weight is enough to crush the rock at its bottom. And so, I can work that through. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say that the force per unit area, and this is what's known as a stress. So I'm suspecting that some of you, like me, at least in the past, have had some confusion about the meaning of stress and strain. Stress is a force-related quantity. Strain is a geometric quantity that tells you about the change of shape of a material. But they're related through Hooke's law. So what we want is we want to have the force per unit area equal to the crushing stress. So this is a material parameter of rock or chalk or whatever. So when I say material parameter, I'm saying that every material has a certain crushing stress at which, if you push with a force per unit area of that magnitude, you'll crush the thing underneath it. And this should be equal to the weight of the column of rock. That's how we will know that the material will fail. So the weight of the column of rock, and then that should be divided by the area at the base. Okay, so we have that sigma crushing, that should be equal to rho A H times G. So this is the mass, so that's mg, and then divided by the area. And so what I get is this really wonderful result, which is rho hg is equal to sigma crushing, or that h is equal to sigma crushing divided by rho g. So there's our really lovely result. It's an estimate for the height of a mountain, and if you put in some characteristic numbers, which I'm not going to do right now, but if you do, for example, sigma crushing like maybe 100 megapascals, and rho for rock, which is maybe 5,000 kilograms per cubic meter, and g 10 meters per second squared, you will get something like, okay, so I guess I'm fibbing, because maybe I am going to try it out. So this is 100 times 10 to the 6th pascals, and then this is 5,000 kilograms per meter cubed, and this is 10 meters per second squared. And actually, I think I should probably do something more like 300 megapascals. What'll come out of this is something on the order of 10,000 meters. Okay, I'll come back and check that later. I may have made a mistake off the top of my head, which is why I didn't want to do this in the first place. So what have we said? So I've basically given a little bit of a sense of one of the ways in which the notion of scale is going to show up repeatedly in the course, and the other way is in the context of how does x scale with y. So here, what I'm interested in is, how does one quantity scale? How does it change as you slide the other one? If I think of the y as the knob, then how does x as an output vary? And we're going to be driven by that kind of worldview throughout the course. And we already did an example of this the other day, which was the diffusion time. And you'll recall that what we said is the diffusion time scales as L squared over D. So in other words, the time to diffuse it goes like the square of the distance, whereas if you have active transport or ballistic motion, the time of transport goes like L over V. So it scales linearly with L and inversely with V. So that is what I mean by scaling. And now, interestingly, we also see that we can construct dimensionless ratios. And we're going to find these dimensionless ratios to be very useful. So I see that T diffusion times D divided by L squared is dimensionless. And that leads me to the last thing that I wanted to say in this brief vignette, which is really by way of introduction to these two different ways about thinking about the notion of scale. So one, in a way, has to do with scale bars and just understanding what sets the magnitude of different quantities in the world around us, whether in the inanimate or the living world. And then the second one, which is in some sense deeper, has to do with trying to understand the nature of the couplings, the correlations between knobs and output variables. So the thing that I would say is that now we're set up to think about a very profound result, and that profound result is the so-called Buckingham Pie Theorem. So let me just put a note to that effect, that there's a formal way to think about these scaling relationships, and one of the things that I do want to do at the moment is I want to make the distinction between knowing about and knowing. So as this course proceeds, I'm going to be aiming at sometimes at knowing, and sometimes I'm going to be aiming at only knowing about. So the way I want you to think of this is that often intellectually, as we try to learn things, that we're going to go through successive approximations to laying out what the subject actually is, and each time we'll reveal a little bit more. We'll peel off another layer of the onion. And here, for today, I just want to give an impression of what this Buckingham Pie Theorem is. It's very deep. There's some mathematics behind the scenes that you can read about if you look on Wiki, just for example. There's also a really nice book by this guy, Don Lemons. And in general, he's one of these guys that over the course of his career, he taught at a small liberal arts college, I guess one might say. I may not be labeling it quite right, but he was a physics professor at a small college, and over the course of his career, I think he must have written at least 5 books. They're all short, and they're all really thoughtful, and actually I will just tell you as a general rule that I think that there are quite a few books that one finds that are quote-unquote pedagogical, where there's a great deal of originality of outlook that come from people that taught at strictly undergraduate institutions, and I really admire Lemons, so I can recommend this book on dimensional analysis to you. And there you can pass from the realm of knowing about to knowing. But here's the thing. What the Buckingham Pie Theorem tells us about is it tells us how many dimensionless variables we can construct in association with a given problem. And that's really wild. In other words, it's telling you that there's certain combinations of the parameters that we know govern the given problem, and they can be assembled to tell us something about the nature of the actual situation. So let me actually use the example shown at the top. So I'm not going to derive it at the moment, but the force to buckle a rod, if you have a rod of length L, think about when you take a straw and you push on it from above. With a sufficient force, it will buckle. And when I say buckle, you know exactly what I mean. It will bow out. And the buckling force, it goes like the Young's modulus, which is E, the areal moment of inertia, which is a geometric quantity that tells you something about the radius of the beam, and then 1 over L squared. So that's the buckling force. And there's a critical buckling force. It's a number that describes a given material, and the dimensionless variable, basically, as you can see on the right-hand side, is what you might call the buckling number. So this Buckingham Pie Theorem, what does it do? It tells us a priori. It tells us how, without doing any big calculations, we can figure out how many independent dimensionless parameters we will have. So, for example, before I give you the example, let's look at what the equations say. So it says number of independent dimensionless parameters is equal to the number of governing variables minus the number of physical dimensions. That's what's shown right here, and that's what I'm referring to. So that's the Buckingham Pie Theorem. So in order for that to make sense to you, I need to explain the two things on the right-hand side. Number of governing variables. Well, let's be concrete. So for the problem of diffusion time, example, time to diffuse a distance L, I called it NV, and I claim that's 3 because we have T diffusion, we have L, and we have D. Those are the three governing variables. In other words, those are the three things that the diffusion time will, there's the diffusion time, and then the length over which something's diffusing, and then the diffusion coefficient. Together, those are the quantities that we want to reason about when we think about a diffusing object. Then the next thing on the right-hand side was this number of physical dimensions, ND, which is number of physical dimensions. And here, for this case, it's equal to 2. Now, how do I know that? Because physical dimensions, just to give you a sense of it, and I'm going to do this again repeatedly, so we're going to come back to this, but you could have mass, you could have length, you could have time, you could have temperature. And what I see is that L and D only involve L and T. So, L is L, and then D is L squared over T. So the only two physical dimensions that appear in our problem are length and time. And so NV minus ND, so number of parameters, dimensionless parameters, is equal to 3 minus 2 is equal to 1. And that dimensionless parameter I just wrote was T diffusion times D over L squared. So that's the single dimensionless ratio that can be constructed for our problem. And so with that as our introduction, what I'm going to do now is we're going to talk about some specific scaling results over the term as we think about things like, for example, the length scale over which a morphogen will be created in an embryo, or the force scale associated with the drag on a bird that's flying during a migration, or so on. Each one of these cases, we will be able to invoke the ideas of the Buckingham Pie Theorem in a way that I think you'll see is very interesting and useful. So with that, we stop this particular vignette, and I look forward to now going into some concrete